I suppose actually up to 5 years ago I was really very, very pessimistic. The Paris Agreement, as you say, was seemed at the time to be at last nations coming to their senses. I walked out of those conferences where I was there, and alongside who was then the chief scientist of this country, and he was walking on air. He said, we've got it, we've got the agreement, and so on. And we have got that agreement. It is true that President Trump doesn't go along with it, and to what extent the United States is going to withdraw from it, we will see. My suspicion is that people will realize that actually the United States, that attitude is outdated. It doesn't apply anymore, and I think that will be overcome. And there's a groundswell internationally of recognizing of what we're doing to the planet and the disaster that awaits unless we do something. The trouble is that the problems are getting worse and worse and worse by the day, and we don't have time to spare. And that's the difficulty.
Can I ask you some questions about how ordinary people should react? Because the British Environment Agency published a thing saying, look, a single-use plastic bag, used once, has better CO2 effect than, and unless you use a cotton bag 130 times, you're putting more CO2 in the production of the cotton bag than in a single-use plastic bag. So should we never use plastic? Would that be your...
We should do our best to avoid the use of plastic, put it that way. And one mustn't maximise the effect of not using a plastic bag. I think it's quite important in a democracy that people actually have something to do to express their concern. And maybe plastic bags aren't the most important element in the whole plastic problem, but it is something that people can do, as well as the fundamentally important thing, of course, which is to put in politicians who actually recognise what the danger is and will do something that's difficult.
Another area where individuals can make a difference, both in terms of environment and in terms of animal welfare, is not eating animals. I know you've said you're not altogether much of a meat eater, you're not sort of ideologically vegetarian, but you're not much of a meat eater. How do you approach that? How do you think we should approach that?
Well, as a biologist, you can recognise what animal has evolved what diet has it evolved to take, to consume. And there's no doubt about it that we are omnivores. I mean, if you look at the structure of our teeth, they're not the teeth of a cow with cud. No, you don't have incisors either, like a rabbit or a rat, to be more accurate. We are omnivores, so biologically there is, if they could have a biological morality, you can say, yes, we evolved to eat pretty well everything. But at the moment, but now we've got to a stage in our own social evolution in which that is no longer practical, because we simply can't destroy the natural forests and plains of the world in order to feed ourselves and destroy the rest of the natural world. We can't afford to do that. So therefore we have to modify our diet.
I wonder if everybody did the right thing, if they all lived by the best in class practice in plastic bag consumption, meat eating consumption. Here's a concern. It's just a concern I have. It might make our existence on Earth more sustainable. But in the long term, the difference between 10 plastic bags a week and 2 plastic bags a week is going to make a difference of 300 years of our time on the planet. Do you understand what I mean? It's sort of big picture terms. It's very, very small.
In the long run, population growth has to come to an end. There are some reasons for thinking that will happen almost inevitably. One of the reasons that the population has increased as fast as it has is that people like me are living longer than we did. And so there are more and more people just because the expectancy of life has increased. But it is very alarming at the rate we're going, and although people will say that in the long run we are going to stabilise, they're going to stabilise, as far as I can see, at a rather higher level than the Earth can really accommodate.
Let's talk a little about television, because in your most remarkable career, which involved being controller of BBC Two at one point and then going back into programme making, a lot has changed in television over the years that you've been involved in the industry.
Mm-hmm.
Better or worse?
Different. The BBC no longer has the sort of magisterial presence which it had. And that's because of the multiplicity of different outlets and different voices. And I think if you're a Democrat, you have to recognise that that's rather good. And that I mean, after all, when I joined television, they were the only television pictures in the country, actually in Western Europe, in 1952. You know, nothing else existed. Well, you have to say that that was unhealthy. I mean, there are losses. You can't do certain things which mass media used to be able to do, and they can't anymore because it isn't economically viable. But by and large, I don't think that's a small price, too big a price to pay.
I don't know if you heard, in August, Cassian Harrison, the editor of BBC Four, said the BBC no longer wants TV shows in which white middle-aged men stand up and explain things. There's a mode of programming involving a presenter, usually white middle-aged male, standing on a hill and telling you like it is. Now, I'm sure he didn't have you in mind.
Well, he might well have done, because that's what I do.
He said
No,
those days have passed. Do you think they've passed? Should they pass?
No, I don't. I don't think they've passed. I personally think there is a place for that sort of thing. I equally don't think there are other things I could describe about the present day output of which there's far too much. So, yeah, but I don't think they're past. Blue Planet, I don't know, that got the biggest audiences of documentaries for a long time. On the other hand, I suppose he might say, well, there wasn't a lot seen of you, which is absolutely true and a very good thing.
Getting you under there.
Yeah. But there are some things that you can't. You do require somebody who knows about something to tell you in terms which don't have bogus illustrations, that don't try and pretend to explain something with a diagram which can't be explained in that way.
I need to ask you about trust, because one of the things that has sort of broken down over the last 30 years is trust and a belief, a sort of cynicism with TV and the cheats involved. And of course, the nature programmes have had their share of the accusations levelled at them. The most recent was the Human Planet 2011, came under fire this year for, it was about the building of a tree house in Papua New Guinea, and I don't want to go into the details. Do you think, when you look at the tricks of the trade, do you think viewers are wise to what's going on? Do you think they are sometimes deceived in the telling of stories? And are they deceived in, if you like, sort of good ways, of television making ways?
I think it's very difficult to generalise. I mean, some viewers might be and others might are maybe more savvy, and some programmes set out to deceive and some do not. On the other hand, it seems to me that the images of television are more difficult to manipulate than words. And that they, although they may be deceptive or deceiving in some times, nonetheless there is a lot of veracity involved in just having the picture there.
Tell us about the tricks, though, in the nature programmes. I mean, is there anything that you think the viewer doesn't understand about the switching between animal in captivity and in the wild, or
I think that's almost a trivial distinction. I mean, it depends what you're doing. If you're doing something and saying, well, I've been out here in the wilderness for a long time and I'm just going along and over there's this wonderful creature, and if I work very hard I might just catch a glimpse, and then you show a picture and that were actually taken in a zoo, that is nonsense, and that is
and you would never have been able to do that.
No, but if on the other hand you say, say the most important thing for you to know about the polar bear's biology is that it has a very long hibernation period, and in the middle, while the female is comatose and hardly perceptive, this little animal comes out in the blackness in this ice cave. And you illustrate that with the birth of a polar bear, which happened to have been taken in a zoo, and which you could never get in the wild without risking the polar bear's life, or indeed your own. Then that's biology. That's perfectly fair. And when I think of the stridency that some parts of the press have criticised this, and I think of the lack of that kind of veracity which they deserve, I mean, it's amazing. I become aghast at the thought.
Right. I want to get on to the comparison between humans and animals. Before I do, did you watch Love Island at all, Sir David?
No.
Right. Let us talk about animals and humans. People are talking about gender at the moment and occasionally reach out to see the way animals behave, not necessarily to justify behaviour, but to kind of understand it. Do you think there's something we can learn about everything from the Me Too movement to the interaction between men and women, patriarchal society? Do we gain anything by looking at the animals?
Well, the animal imperatives come from straightforward physiology. And there are characteristics that men have and that women have, which have evolved for the various roles that they played in prehistory. Unfortunately, but we're not living in prehistory, we're living today. Nonetheless, those physiological characteristics impose behaviour on ourselves, and you ignore them at your peril.
Right. So they help understand, but not justify.
And that's right.
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
so.
Yeah.
That's so.
What about? I mean, where are you on where the world is today? Because a lot of people feel the world is going bonkers at the moment, and it's got very tribal, hasn't it?
Mm.
The innate tribalism, destructive tribalism of human beings, their willingness to be really quite beastly to people outside their group.
Yes.
Should we think of that as a kind of, that's just what human beings are?
Well, you look at our prehistory, and that's what we were. I mean, the remarkable thing is that we've come together to the degree that we have, in my view. I mean, the United Nations in the 30s was one thing, the League of Nations was one thing, and that was a step towards listening to other people. And we've got the United Nations now. Now, that's remarkable, you know. That has never happened before the 20th century. You know, we never had I mean, the whole of history is about battles between different nations. And the fact that we have an area in which you can debate these things and not solve them necessarily by force is an advance. And it's a matter for surprise and support rather than criticism.
It's a lovely book, Life on Earth, 40 years after the original series. Sir David Attenborough, nice to talk to you.
Thank you very much.